Thank you all very much for tuning in today. And you're watching the Oxford Political Review present a panel on what is Sri Lanka's economic future. I'm Brian Wong, the co-founder and a Rhodes Scholar of the Oxford Political Review, and we're incredibly honoured to be joined by an absolutely stellar panel of external speakers and veteran experts on this subject matter. So allow me to introduce them one by one. First up, we have Dr. Shanta Devarajan, who's the former chief economist at the World Bank and a leading academic at Georgetown University. Second, we have Dr. Harsha de Silva, the former Minister of Economic Reforms and Public Distribution and Chairman of the Committee on Public Finance in Sri Lanka. Third up, we have Dr. Sharmini Coorey, the former Director of the Institute for Capacity Development at the IMF. And fourth, and last but not least, we have Mr. Talal Rafi, a senior global management consultant at Deloitte, and a very thoughtful writer and experienced commentator on Sri Lankan economy and politics at large. It is an absolute privilege and honor to be joined by all of you, to have you here with us today at the review. Thank you. So on that note, I'd just like to start by establishing the broad tendencies and trajectories concerning the state of the Sri Lankan economy as it stands today. And as we flagged in the promotion and the description for this panel, Sri Lanka today stands at a crossroads. It is beset and also riddled with a series of economic malaise, some say politically rooted, some say structurally and governmentally sourced and grounded, and still others suggest that this is to do with the industrial structures and policies that have been pursued over the past few decades. What I'd just like to start here with is to gauge, broadly speaking, from each of our panelists, what are your thoughts on the present state? If you were to present a 2 to 3 minute snapshot and diagnosis of Sri Lanka's economy today, what exactly would that diagnosis be? And I was wondering if we could start with Dr. Sharmini, if that's all right.
Thank you, Brian. Very happy to be here, and thank you very much for inviting us, and also talking about Sri Lanka, because I think as you said, it's at a very crucial point. Look, the economy at the moment is really in my view, at a very, very critical point. We have a very narrow window in which to act. And as you know, we are waiting to see if we can access an IMF program. We have a staff level agreement, but we have to get board approval, and also financing assurances and debt restructuring. But at the same time, there are all political pressures that are building up. There are all sorts of protests about much needed reforms. So it's really important that Sri Lanka acts now with great prudence and implements the policies that are needed. All these policies are needed, really, and the government has been implementing them. And what's really critical is for the population really to come, and the political parties to come behind and help these reforms through. This is not a partisan issue. This is an issue for the country. And so it's very important at this point that everybody supports the fiscal consolidation, the underlying structural reforms, the strengthening of the institutions that are being enacted, and there's more that will be needed. So I think we are at a very critical point in the economy.
Thank you very much, Sharmini. And on the note of cross-partisan collaboration, I'd like to take this opportunity to invite Harsha. Would you perhaps like to comment on your assessment as well and your take?
Thank you very much for the invitation, Brian. I don't disagree with how Sharmini sort of laid out where we are. And yes, we have a complex set of problems that need to be resolved. Moving to the more political aspect of the solution, we are facing serious headwinds now because, for one, to stabilize the economy, interest rates went up from what it used to be around 5%. It went up to 32-33% on treasury bills. It has stabilized around 29-30%. But what that means is industries are shutting down, companies are closing up, jobs are getting lost. Small and medium guys just cannot pay their debt. Credit card bills are piling up on the one hand. And on the other, you see the taxes that were introduced, which went up from 18% to 36% at the highest margin, are causing some serious issues, particularly with professionals who are sort of, voting with their feet, really. Someone told me that in the last 2 weeks, a Melbourne immigration lawyer working with Sri Lankans received 282 applications to migrate to Australia. And that's a real issue. And so the people obviously are unhappy. I'm not saying that this is not something we had to do. We had to do what we had to do. But how do you manage the politics? So from our sort of angle, from the main opposition, we've been very supportive of the general plan. In fact, it was I who first suggested to the government in 2020 mid that we should go to the IMF and resolve the problem before it became such a mess. Unfortunately, that advice was not heeded. And by the time we went to the IMF, it was way too late. We had defaulted on our debt. And therefore, it's no longer a transaction between the government of Sri Lanka and the IMF, but the third party, with the third party itself is, multiple third parties, from multilateral debtors to bilateral debtors, creditors, to a whole bunch of creditors who've lent us privately on international sovereign bonds. So in order to get everybody to agree on a plan based on the IMF's DSA, these things, like I said, had to be done. But the challenge for the government currently is, how do you deal with the people? We had an uprising. We chased away the president. We chased away the prime minister, rather the people, and the minister of finance. Now we have someone who, in my view, understands the complexity of the issue, what needs to be done, but he does not have a mandate. You see, he actually was not able to win his seat, and he came on the national list. So he was the only MP from his party who suddenly became the president. So there is a political issue that needs to be resolved. So that's how I look at it from a sort of a socio-political angle, while not disagreeing with what Sharmini said.
Thank you very much, Harsha. We've heard from the IMF angle. We've also heard from the parliamentarian and the political lenses. And now allow me to take this privilege and honor to have Shanta share with us your perspectives, given your extensive experience, not just at the World Bank, but also as a leading development economist in the world. What do you think is the root of the melee, and how do you see Sri Lanka positioning itself going forward? Is this a development issue? Is this an accountability issue? Or is this, more generally speaking, a foreign policy and a political question at its core? Oh, I think you might be muted. Might it work to unplug your headset, if that's okay? You might want to unplug the headset altogether. Not an issue. Shanta, we'll return to you very shortly. I'll just bring in Talal right here, and whilst you're sorting out the minor technical issues, if that's okay. Thank you very much, Talal.
Right. First of all, thanks, Brian. Thanks a lot for having me. It's an absolute pleasure. And so I agree with Sharmini and Harsha on both the economic side and the political side. And to give a fair assessment of the situation, I mean, the situation is quite bad. Whatever we were experiencing due to inflation, everybody's salary remains the same, but the prices have gone up. And there's also shrinkflation. When you go to a restaurant, the portions are much smaller. And unsustainable debt, a forex crisis, and high inflation So we've got like everything coming at us. And the important factor to note is like Sri Lanka is going through such a big crisis. At the same time, the rest of the world is also facing a calamity. So there are a number of different crises. According to the UN, 54 nations are under debt stress. So it's a bad time to be there, especially when your friends are also not in a good situation to bail you out. But as far as I'm concerned in this situation, I think we should look at it in a positive way. I mean, Sri Lanka, as far as I'm concerned, Sri Lanka is at a crossroad. I mean, there are two options we have. One is we can do the necessary reforms like how Dr. Manmohan Singh did in India in 1991 or Thailand did. And they never went to the IMF. I mean, India never really needed the IMF after that. Or we can be like Argentina. But looking at the current situation, I think it's a bit of a political challenge for any party if they come to do that. I mean, we've had a few protests. I mean, now protesters are even demanding that interest rates be lowered. So that's like going into the territory of the central bank. So with such this thing, I mean, it might be a challenge. So hopefully we can get the reforms right. And for example, in my assessment, what the IMF says is quite obvious. I mean, it's what we should have been doing for the last 75 years, and we wouldn't be in trouble. Like, for example, restructuring state-owned enterprises, fiscal discipline. I mean, Sri Lanka only has had a primary budget surplus for 4 years out of the 75 years. I mean, this is quite bad and consistently large interest rates. So what the IMF says is obvious, and if we can, it's just that it's tough because we're going there at the last moment. Like Dr. Harsha said, if we had gone earlier, the treatment would have been very simple, like going to an OPD doctor. Because we went to the last minute, we're in the ICU. So that's just a sum of the situation is in my view. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And just on this, could I just bring in Shanta again to see if your microphone works? Unfortunately, it still doesn't, but you might want to unplug the headphones if that's all right. No worries. And just unplug it from the laptop altogether so you can use the laptop's microphone instead. No luck, unfortunately. I think we're still on a slightly difficult situation.
Not that I'm much of a technological wizard, but I wonder, Shanta, when you signed in, did you give access to the mic? Okay.
I see. Would there be another device that we could potentially resort to? Yes, perfect. And whilst Shanta's on that, not an issue at all, we're just going to kickstart the discussion right away on the problem diagnosis, because across all three of your introductory remarks, it strikes me that there's an undergirding component here, which is the people. And whilst the people are obviously the source of democratic and political mandate for any say in government at large, there's also broader concern that the populist whims of pandering to the people might be a part of the causes that led us to the poly-crisis that we see today. So if we look at the fertilizer decisions conducted, or the decision concerning the fertilizer switch and ban on imports, alternatively, the attempts to rile up and to boost domestic morale through basically doubling down on forms of public sector spending over the past few years, might that not be, as some suggest, right, a cause of the economic problems that afflict Sri Lanka today? And I was wondering what your thoughts are, the three of you, on the extent to which it's populism, it is welfarist tendencies to give and give and give that have sent us into, or sent the country into, such a difficult spot today. So maybe on that front, Harsha, would you like to comment and come in here? And I think you're muted.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, welfare politics, right? I mean, Joan Robinson, I think, long years back, 50, 60 years ago, said, look, Sri Lanka is enjoying the fruits, but the seed has not yet been planted. Others have said, look, it's an auction of unavailable or non-existent resources at every election. The welfare structures that we have go back before independence. And it was during the British that the rice and others were given at sub-market prices. So this has continued. And like Talal referred to earlier, you see, we've continued to spend more than what we earned. So in that context, we have not been disciplined, right? So it is not just the fertilizer ban or the pandemic that just accelerated the decline, but it's the structural problems that we've faced throughout what had brought us to a very precarious situation. So sort of the irresponsible decisions of the fertilizer and others just was the catalyst that just created the havoc. Now, so in that context, people in this country are kind of used to non-market reflecting prices, right? Whether it is fuel, and I think the biggest issue that caused all these problems is that the successive governments didn't have the political will to price energy appropriately. And that's really where the SOE losses are coming from. And that sort of has spread across the economy. Because the Ceylon Electricity Board and the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation are the real, causes of the sort of the situation that we got into towards the end. So, in that, how do we explain to the people that they have to pay market prices, right? And this is something a lot of us have been grappling with, and this discussion, particularly with Shanta, for a decade plus, has been happening with various folks in government. But the issue now is that while the prices have been adjusted to reflect cost, those who need to be able to sort of helped out to afford those prices, that part of the puzzle has not been resolved, right? So prices went up, but those who need to be like I said, helped, have not seen that help coming. So that is a problem of perhaps sequencing even, which is now creating these problems, because the pain is real. The pain is real. And I see that as a local politician when I go visit low-income areas in my own electorate. I see mothers wanting to purchase a spoonful of milk powder. I mean, people must not be subjected to such misery, you see, and kids can't go to school because they can't buy school books, etc. So what I'm saying is, yes, true. As technical people, we know what needs to be done, but because of the attitudes and the long years of subsidy, how do we gradually take people to market pricing? How do we ensure that those who need to be supported are getting that support that they desperately need? So I think that's really the question that we need to answer.
I hear you. Thank you, Harsha, for that. And just on that note, I'd like to bring in Shanta, who's I hope all is well with you.
I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, this is fantastic. Loud and clear, very mellifluous. Thank you so much for joining us. Just wondering if you'd like to share your thoughts on the present state of Sri Lanka and its root causes.
Okay, well, thank you. And I think Harsha's latest remarks is a good lead into what I was planning on saying. First, the crisis in Sri Lanka is not just the acute crisis at the moment of a debt and a foreign exchange crisis and shortages and a fiscal crisis, but it's a long-standing crisis that goes back 50 years or maybe even 75 years of a series of policies such as the energy subsidies that Harsha was referring to, which have all been designed to minimize the government's accountability to the people. See, if you think about a subsidy, what is a subsidy? It actually means that the electric utility, the Ceylon Electricity Board in this case, is not accountable to its customers. It is accountable to the government, which provides a subsidy. So the people of Sri Lanka have no way of holding the CEB accountable. So if the CEB cuts off electricity in Colombo, they can't do anything about it, because it's the government that actually can do something about it. And this is true of a whole series of policies that go back, as I said, 75 years. And the second aspect, which is raised by the Aragalaya movement, the people's movement that threw out the former president, is that these policies also disempower poor people. Take the energy subsidies. 40% of fuel subsidies go to the richest 20% of the population. Right? Think about that. So you're giving a transfer that actually is biased towards the rich. If you just handed out that money as cash rather than as subsidies equally to the entire population, it would be only 20% that get of the rich that get it. So this is a real transfer to the non-poor, to the rich. And this is outrageous in a country where, as Harsha was just describing, poor people are struggling just to feed their kids. We're continuing to finance the rich, and it's unacceptable. That's not all. We also have, Sri Lanka has, for going back 75 years, the Paddy Lands Act, which is a policy that forces farmers to produce paddy, to produce rice. Now, rice or paddy is the least productive crop of all food crops in Sri Lanka, and it's the least lucrative. So it's not surprising that about 50% of these farmers are poor, because they can't grow things that might actually make them money. I remember Harsha and I were together once when we found that there was a farmer who was fined 75,000 rupees for growing bananas in his plot, because it's illegal, but he actually thought it was actually profitable for him to grow bananas. These are the kinds of policies that have undermined the ability of Sri Lankan people to make a living. And if we don't reform these policies now, we'll never come out of this crisis. There will be another debt crisis 5 years from now, because these are the things that have been diminishing the ability of the economy to grow. The way you have to do it is to grow. And just one final point on this is trade policy. I mean, Sri Lanka, in many ways, is a poster child of a successful trade liberalization in the 1970s. When they liberalized trade, the economy's growth rate doubled overnight. We had a doubling of the per capita GDP growth rate, and unemployment came down to 3.5% or something. Right? Today, it's going in the reverse direction. They've actually been protecting the economy, increasing trade restrictions. The trade ratio has been declining, and growth has been declining. So it's time to reverse that. And keep in mind, that's another case of accountability, because if you open up trade, if you liberalize trade, then Sri Lankan entrepreneurs are accountable to world markets, to world prices. That's an apolitical form of accountability. If you protect trade, they're accountable to the government, so the government can control them. And you know that the government controls them based on their political whims and fancies. So this is one way, again, of insulating the entrepreneurs, the Sri Lankan people, from the capricious moves of a government. And that's got to be the basis of a reform program. And I would, Harsha said, how do you sell this to the people? This is how to sell it to the people, is to say, this is empowering people. It's not disempowering them, it's actually doing the reverse.
I want to circle back to Harsha in a second concerning this thought on empowering the people in narrative frame. And thank you so much, Shanta, for your thoughts. But as I see it, there are sort of three broad strands that are emerging from a discussion thus far concerning the plausible sources of the melee. The first is the inefficient allocation of subsidies, as well as, broadly speaking, state-owned enterprise policies and the cultivation of very plastic expectations and effectively engineer inefficiencies within the economy. The second is this over-reliance increasingly over the past few decades, touching upon something Shanta brought up in the second part of your comments, of import substitution, or rather a shift away from Sri Lanka being an export-driven economy towards, I guess, an economy that has, a sizable trade deficit and balance of payment deficit, so to speak. And the third, of course, is the social political turmoil that's rocked the city, kind of country, alongside the COVID pandemic, which has engendered not just a deficit in forex access, but also in investors' confidence cratering and a credit rating being sabotaged in the process of so doing. So I want to bring in Sharmini here. Would you say any of these three strands, or maybe none of these three strands, in your view, is the best reading or articulation of what got us here over the past few years?
I would say, and I really agree with everything that Harsha and Shanta just said. I don't think it's a matter of either or. It's all of them. And they're mutually self-reinforcing. If you think about it, all the things that have been mentioned, they are completely internally consistent, which is why this system has lasted for 75 years. And I would throw into that one other, I just want to throw a statistic in which to supplement or to reinforce what Shanta was saying. In 1960, exports of goods and services to GDP was 30%. In 2018, in 2000, it was 39%. Pre-pandemic, so let's take out the pandemic, it had gone down to 23% of GDP, and in 2021, it was 17%. So, we've just sort of, you can see now, these are all, to me, I would throw in one other factor that sort of gels it all, and that is that the political class engaged in massive corruption. So, then it's not that people couldn't figure out what sensible policies were. I think they pretty much figured it out many years ago. But because state capture by elites is part and parcel of bringing all these strands you identified together, what has happened is that the political classes, not everybody, and Harsha, you're certainly not one of the people I'm talking about, but we all know that there are plenty of politicians who find it very advantageous to maintain these kinds of policies where they're not accountable. They rob the state and then sort of give little tidbits to the population, and then, of course, serve the elites, the economic elites, and the system with all its protection, the large patronage system through the state-owned enterprises. Something like close to 1 in 4 workers is a public sector worker. I mean, the whole system is self-reinforcing. And to break it, and we've brought ourselves to a point where we now have to get rid of this. And we can, either be like Talal was saying, either like India or Argentina, or I would say you can think of other countries that in Southeast Asia that are far more successful than even India. So I think that we have to create we have to have an honesty and to be able to say these things to people and have the courage. I would like to see our politicians also have a bit more courage to explain to people why they are where they are. I think the Aragalia movement did identify exactly the kinds of things we're talking about. So that's very inspiring, frankly, because that shows that they didn't blame outside forces. They didn't blame, the West or, private creditors or IMF or whatever the usual suspects are. They blamed the leaders, and they also said they wanted accountability and honest government. They want honest, competent government. That's not too much to ask for. And so I think we are all very agreed on what the policies, what caused this. And I suspect when you start talking about policies, how to fix it, which is to reverse some of these things. But I think what is difficult is to get political unity to move in that direction and to break the grip of the political and economic elites. I think that is very difficult, and that's where we are, but we need to do it.
I hear you, Sharmini. And that's a very salient and poignant point, actually. And I just want to bring in Talal very briefly on this. Some say that the political question that Sharmini was hinting at just then is something that can be attributed distinctly to certain figures. So, for instance, a certain family or a set of brothers that have been very prominent in Sri Lanka. Others say it's to do with the bureaucracy. It's a civil service. It's more structural and endemic than just a few brothers. And then there are those who hold the view that actually the international community, the political community at large, has been silent enablers of the mess that Sri Lanka finds itself in. I was just wondering, from your point of view, as more of, I guess, a technocratic, sort of economics-driven analyst and expert here, what do you make of this sort of range of interpretations? Do you see any of them as holding more water or truth than the others?
So, in my view, I mean, there are views that certain families have done it, but I would say that it's as a whole, a bureaucracy, political families, and most importantly, the people of Sri Lanka as well. So, because let me just go into some of the history. I mean, people, presidents, prime ministers were voted into power because of populist promises, rise from the moon. Then we had bread at 3 rupees or a salary increase of 10,000. Free fertilizer, low taxation. So it was also something that the people wanted it, accepted it. So the politicians gave it. So if we are going to, the people are not going to take the blame, I don't think we can come out of it properly if there is a proper understanding. And most of the voters did not have a proper understanding. So that is one factor. But at the same time, I think there was also a sort of a shift in directions. Because after 1977, when the reforms were brought in by President J.R. Jayawardena for 17 years, and followed up by Ranasinghe Premadasa, and when President Chandrika came in from the opposition, it was a totally different party. Her mother was responsible for very drastic social change. The surprising thing was President Chandrika continued the drive. So many privatization was done, and trade was liberalized. So there was a sort of a consensus from 1977 till 2005. From 2005, we saw sort of a shift towards import substitution. So that is an area where we need to find, because now global trade has changed. We're looking more into tapping into global supply chains. Like an example would be an iPhone in China. Only 7% of the value addition is done there, and 1.5 million work for it, or 1.3. But still, even a manufacturing superpower such as China needs components from 43 different countries to produce an iPhone. So if you're going to say, like, if Sri Lanka can do this with just over 1/100th of the population of China, I mean, that's a sort of a impossible task. And lastly, we also need to work on the ease of doing business. I mean, there's a lot of bureaucracy. We're 99th on the ease of doing business and 162nd when it comes to law enforcement. So sort of like ease of doing business, the resistance, in my opinion, would come from the bureaucracy. And it kind of explains why Sri Lanka has one of the lowest entrepreneurs to GDP ratio. Formally 1%, informally 3%. Vietnam, Thailand, it's over 20%. So two ways of the economy expanding, the private sector. One is for current businesses to expand. The other is to bring new businesses. So without a proper drive for entrepreneurs to come in, I mean, improving ease of doing business, it's going to be a hard way forward.
Thank you, Talal. So let's move on to the segment on solutions then. A lot of problems, a lot of issues. Let's try and tackle some of them. And here I'd like to perhaps pursue a shift in direction to maybe look at what's going on right now with regards to the elephant in the room, which is quite literally, of course, the IMF and the interplay between China, Sri Lanka, and the IMF, where it strikes me, at least from as an outsider looking at the situation, that China has been quite reticent, reluctant to endorse an extended sort of period of moratorium, so to speak, on repayment. And instead, there's been a lot of pressure from the Chinese Exim Bank for a 2-year moratorium repayment period as at least a significant precondition to its willingness to sign off on the restructuring and the packages at large that we see in Sri Lanka right now. So I want to just turn here to Sharmini, actually. Do you see this as a deal breaker, or do you think the Chinese would eventually return to the table, or that maybe we can do away without the Chinese altogether in this process? Just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, so Brad, just to be clear, so for the last over 50 years, the world international economic system has figured out what to do with countries that that are unable to pay their debts. Okay, and a lot of this in the past was led through the Paris Club, and there were certain rules of the game when the country, went bankrupt, like we are. They went to the IMF, Paris Club. The debt was restructured, and then in somewhere in the I guess 80s and 90s, the private sector came in, but still the official creditors were in the Paris Club. So it was relatively straightforward once you had the private creditors sorted out, and the policies were adapted so that they could be handled in an effective way. The way the system works is that the IMF has something called a debt sustainability analysis. It gives, and it's not just an academic exercise. It projects forward what the country needs to get in terms of, when it makes its best fiscal efforts. Tough, as we can see in Sri Lanka, those fiscal measures can get, difficult. We've just been discussing it, but it's still not enough for the country to restore debt sustainability and access markets again, right? Capital markets. So, which middle-income countries like us need to do. So, what the structure is that they have then a debt reduction. Creditors agree to write down in various forms, reduce the debt burden so that countries can restore their debt's fiscal and debt sustainability. So you make your best fiscal effort, it's not enough. So the creditors bring down the amount that's due, and the country can grow again. And the sooner you do this, the better, because we all know that the countries like Sri Lanka that are not going through such pain now, the productive structure is being destroyed, and value is being destroyed the longer this drags on. Now, what's happening with the holdouts, like you said, we now have two countries that are very prominent, but there are others. So there's China, India, Saudi Arabia, and other countries that have become creditors that are not in the Paris Club. And the question is how to include them. And it's not a difficult thing. You can just agree to you don't have to join. They've been invited, but they don't join it. They can be working with them, even if you don't want to join them, but none of the above. So India, I have to say, and congratulate them, and we should be very grateful, has given financing assurances in specific terms that says we're willing to, when you say financing assurances, is not just new money, it's reducing the debt burden, that they would help reduce the debt burden to the levels that are specified in this debt sustainability analysis. China, on the other hand, has refused to do so. It is the one outlier in the whole system. So, when they say they give a moratorium for 2 years, it's simply not enough. It's not a mere question. The debt continues. You have a moratorium, but at the end of the 2 years, the debt is still there. It's not a debt reduction. People get confused about the two things. So you can postpone the debt profile, but what's called the net present value of the debt, that is the stream of payments the country must make, discounted to today's terms, is unchanged. The way, let me say that China believe they struck a deal with, it was El Salvador, and the net present value was reduced by only 3%. So we need to have agreement from China to reduce our debt. It doesn't have to be a haircut up front. It could be in the form of lower interest payments for the duration of the outstanding amounts. It can be the restructuring and the rescheduling of the principal dues. So it can be a haircut. The private creditors have written to the IMF and agreed that they will provide financing assurances. They will provide debt. They're willing to provide debt reduction on the amount specified, and the DSA targets are mentioned in the letter to India that was leaked, so you can access it in the public. It's in the public domain now, and the private creditors have said they would do it. So we absolutely need China on board. Now, I'm taking a bit of time, but let me explain, because there's so much confusion on these things. The policy of the IMF does allow the IMF to proceed. It's called the lending into official arrears policy. Allows a country to access IMF resources as long as it's below a threshold, 50%. It's in the website. You can read the policy. And we are actually, scrape just under. You asked how can we proceed without China? Technically, we can, because we come within the four corners of the policy. It's a bit lower than 50%, so we could, proceed. However, it's a bit difficult because China has, in other cases, insisted on being paid on more favorable terms than the other creditors. And this is a second part of what's needed in a debt restructuring, intercreditor comparable treatment. It is a cornerstone of the international architecture that I just described, that you kind of try to share the burden equally across creditors. That is a question whether China would accept being treated equally, what we call comparable treatment. They don't have a good record there, unfortunately. So we have to, there's not much of a record. These are relatively new problems. So other creditors are not happy they don't want to let the Sri Lanka, the program proceed to the board, because we're waiting for China to agree to these terms, comparable treatment and willingness to write down the debt so that the debt would be sustainable for Sri Lanka. So this is where things are a little bit stuck at the moment. We are hoping very much that China will come through and that it'll consider the case. I know that they have, they're not, they have good reason as well. There are many other countries that are in the queue potentially coming up that will also require debt write-downs, and that they have to consider a lot of things. It's not just Sri Lanka, right? So one can understand that it takes a bit of time to figure it out, but until they do it, it's very difficult to see whether we are at the mercy of the other creditors now to sort of either decide to apply the policy, or to sort of say, no, look, if we apply the policy, but China doesn't get equal treatment, it'll extract higher payments from Sri Lanka. Then Sri Lanka would give the other countries, other creditors. That would be a problem. It destroys the international architecture that has worked for 50 years or more. So that's where we are now. I took a bit of time, but I just wanted to explain, because it's kind of a complicated situation.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for that incredibly informative and also elaborate discussion and presentation from you, Sharmini. Really appreciate the sort of clarification, which elucidates the picture. It's a very messy situation, but I think that certainly elucidated what's going on. I'd like to bring in Harsha here, if I could. So turning back to the domestic level, or the domestic context at hand here. Now, obviously, in the introductory remarks just then, you flagged the importance of fiscal discipline and to move against the populist tendencies to misallocate or to inefficiently allocate in many ways the funds in accordance with the whims of, I guess, the times and also the people that may not be economically utile, may not be productive. I was just looking at a recent article concerning a proposed policy that the SJB is planning to take into the upcoming election potentially, which concerns raising the threshold for the income tax. And I was just wondering, there might be concerns on the part of some that essentially there'd be a greater government deficit on one hand, and yet a reduction in the volume of government revenue that could sustain and also allow for that lowering of tax threshold. And obviously, on the other hand, you've got a pro-economic argument that lowering of the tax threshold is essential in driving forward the growth and increasing the overarching circulation of capital within the economy at large. But could I just ask you for your thoughts on that? Do you see a tension? Do you see any concerns with this proposed lowering of threshold, or do you instead see it as an integral part of the reforms going forward?
I need to clarify. You said lowering the threshold. No.
Sorry, raising the threshold. I stand corrected. Raising the threshold for taxes.
Yeah. Okay. So, you see, there's a lot of confusion in terms of how much money the Treasury can bring in through this proposed new thresholds and slabs. Okay, so we went from highest marginal tax bracket of 18 to 36. Now, the president, in his address to Parliament a couple of days ago, said that if we do away with payee tax, we are going to lose 100 billion rupees, which the other way looking at it means, look, payee is going to bring us $100 billion. Now, I completely disagree with that number, and for good reason. If you look at the available data, unfortunately, the government has not thought it fit even to share some of the workings with the chairperson and my committee, which is the Committee on Public Finance. And by the way, the news yesterday and today is that I've been fired from this committee. The president prorogued Parliament, which meant all committees were dismissed. There is a lot of talk that the government does not want me back as chair of this committee. And as a matter of fact, the government has named their members to the committee, and they brought in their big guns who generally don't agree to any of these types of reforms that we are talking about. Now, park that for a moment. Our discussions with the Department of Inland Revenue and the Ministry of Finance resulted in them telling us the figure was 68 billion. And these are records submitted to Parliament, to my committee. A few days later, they said, no, it's 100 billion. I mean, that's a big difference. How can you go from 68 billion to 100 billion? And when my analysts work these numbers through, we get something like 48 billion. You see, so there's a massive discrepancy. And even in the letter by the private creditors to the IMF, they said, look, we want to see these workings. We want to look at the assumptions, right? So which means they are also not certain about or not willing to accept these numbers that have been put up by the government as credible. And I'm sorry to say, right? Otherwise, why would they put that sentence in their letter? So I have, with my team, looked at different ways in which you can raise more than 48 billion, right? And once again, I'm telling you, 48 billion is the numbers, data that is available to us. I don't have any further data, right? Assuming that it is 48 billion through, based on the data set, we can certainly have other combinations that you can make more than 48 billion and still keep the professionals under 36% at the margin. I mean, you're looking at 36% at the highest margin at 350,000 rupees. So what is the 360,000? 350,000, right? Divide by, how much is it now? 370, right? It's less than $1,000, $900, $940, and you have the highest tax bracket, right? I mean, so you can still hold these guys between around 24%, but certainly the highest tax highest bracket at a much higher threshold will have to pay more than 36%, right? And even in America, I mean, people pay 39-40% tax. And if you look at taxes, how countries have taxed people, I mean, it had the highest tax bracket had been over 80%, I think, even in the US, right? I mean, I was reading somewhere that South Korea had the highest marginal tax bracket was not 90% at one point, had come down. So when you say, look, you need to bring revenue in terms of taxes into the treasury, it has to be equitable, right? And also, I am telling you this with the great sense of responsibility. From the data that we have, only 149,000 people paid pay tax. right? I mean, so even if you reduce the margin, you're going to catch guys who are making, 100,000 rupees a month or thereabouts, right? So therefore, I don't see this number as being credible, right? And given that, I am saying there are many other ways that you can get that number or a bigger number by holding, our professionals who are trying to leave at around 24%, but whack the higher rate, perhaps even a surcharge for a given period of time towards the much higher income earners. But I want to say something else, if I may, Brian, in terms of what Sharmini said with China. And it is that my discussions with the Chinese suggest to me that it is beyond a Sri Lanka issue, right? And that they need to be treated equally. And my discussions with them goes as such. Why do we need to listen to the IMF? Right? Why should we follow the DSA, the debt sustainability analysis, and the resulting numbers that IMF says should be the targets for the government of Sri Lanka? Right? How come the IMF, the World Bank, and the ADB gets paid, and we need to cut the amounts that they owe to us? So there is that issue there, and even in the now, Sharmini was talking about lending into official arrears policy, right? Fine, and I didn't know about this 50%. Perhaps after this call, I want to talk to her about this 50%. She said we just scraped through because we are just under 50%. Even having, let's say that's fine, but the IMF just 2 days ago said, look, unless we have credible and specific assurances from China, it's not possible for us to go ahead, right? And even the private creditors said that. Not only did they say that, they said, look, we want a comparable treatment of creditors, which means obviously China and India will have to sort of sing off the same hymn sheet. So I am skeptical, Sharmini. You know better than me how the IMF works. Shanta knows better than me. I'm just an observer. But I'm skeptical that the lending into official areas would get implemented in the Sri Lanka case. I stand to be corrected, and perhaps we should have a longer discussion on that.
Thank you, Harsha. And we'll return to exactly that question between you and Sharmini shortly. And I also want to loop back to what you said about you're being left out of COPF, which is most certainly a loss to the country. But I want to bring in Shanta here, because one core facet in this ongoing dialectic between China, Sri Lanka, and also the IMF is that China has recently expressed, I think 7 to 8 days ago, actually, that it's keen to seek and it's open to supporting more proactively what's going on right now with the IMF, provided that the World Bank would also be joining in on the sort of debt relief programs in relation to Sri Lanka. So China's stipulated, as Harsha flagged just then, that it is open to, in theory, joining in, but it needs sort of buy-in and participation from other actors as well, e.g. the World Bank, so to speak. How feasible is this? Is this a reasonable ask? And more broadly speaking, what's going on in the World Bank concerning the diagnosis of Sri Lanka? Shanta, could I just bring you in on this? Thank you.
Sure. We need to separate two things that sometimes get convoluted. The World Bank is ready to provide large amounts of budget support to Sri Lanka as soon as the IMF Extended Fund Facility, the EFF program, is signed. That's part of the rules of the World Bank. They cannot lend to a country that has got an unsustainable debt unless the IMF program has been resolved. So, there's no shortage of willingness to support Sri Lanka once that is done. to the tune of five. I think World Bank and ADB together will be about $5 billion, which is bigger than the IMF program. The second part, which is what the Chinese have been saying, and I think Harsha or somebody repeated this, is why aren't the international financial institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, also reducing their debt to Sri Lanka? Why aren't they taking a haircut, if you like, alongside all the other creditors? That's frankly, I think that's just a rhetorical point. They know fully well, and we know fully well, that these institutions, of which they are members, I might add, cannot fulfill their role as lender of last resort. If the IMF is part of the debt relief package, then it can no longer be the lender of last resort, which is its primary mandate. So this, to me, is a red herring, but it seems to be a powerful rhetorical point that the Chinese keep repeating over and over again. And it's only the Chinese that I hear this from. Nobody else seems to think that way. None of the other creditors think that way. And in fact, the other creditors object to that statement. So let's separate those two. There's no shortage of World Bank support that is waiting, literally with bated breath, to support Sri Lanka, but it's in the form of budget support that Sri Lanka can then use to buy the fuel and fertilizer and medicines and food that it desperately needs.
Thank you for that clarification. That's very helpful, actually. And it also suggests to us that perhaps when thinking about the path forward for Sri Lanka, obviously negotiating and brokering terms that would work for China, that's a core part of the question. But maybe another actor that's been hitherto underexplored and I'd like to spend a bit more time on is India. So obviously Sri Lanka and India have had a very interesting and at times a complex, at times potentially tense, at other times a complementary relationship over the past 60 to 70 years. And one ongoing theme or motif that keeps recurring in discussions concerning India's recent overtures and also, to use Sharmini's words, generosity and charitableness towards Sri Lanka is that whilst this is an essential step and it has offered many an olive branch and also an extension of help to Sri Lanka at times like these, there are also residual concerns that this might imply or result in greater political influence or subtler, softer influence from India over Sri Lanka, whereas those who are in favor of accepting the support from India, not just in terms of currency swaps over the Forex crisis previously, but also in what's going on right now with debt restructuring, would say, well, this is a logical implication of a very severe and urgent crisis that needs resolution. So might I just bring in very quickly Talal and then Harsha here on your thoughts concerning essentially, what do you make of this all concerning India and Sri Lanka? And more generally speaking, are there any foreign policy implications and takeaways from the economic discussion that we've been having hitherto thus far? So Talal first. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. So regarding India, so I've said this before as well. I mean, we have very good relations with others, prioritized probably relations with Japan is a very long-term friend. China, I mean, during, I think, the early 50s, very helpful. The US and EU, we export a lot. But India would be our most strategic and most important relations to have. Because one is they are our immediate neighbor and we share a language. And it's also like, since we are located so closely, it's other reasons as well, political, security-wise. And so India and Sri Lanka have no other choice but to be on good relations. So that's something like if you ask China, I mean, probably Taiwan or Japan, North Korea would be a priority. But for India, I mean, Sri Lanka is this thing. So here, the relationship, India has other concerns as well, other than economic. Like, for example, India pushing the 13th Amendment, which is facing a lot of resistance. So, kind of relationships with India is something that's most needed, but it's also a bit more complicated because of certain conditions they have due to pressure from a minority within India. So the relationship is complex, but in my word, I believe that we should always prioritize India first policy, while at the same time respecting and having the best of relations with all other countries.
Thank you, Talal. Harsha, would you agree with Talal's approach there?
I mean, certainly it is sort of a holistic relationship. It's politics, a lot of politics. And if not for India, we would already, I don't know. They helped us, and we appreciate it very much. Almost $4 billion. They hadn't done it at all to anybody else. And I know they were being asked questions, why giving so much money to India when there are certain states that desperately need money from the center? You're not giving us, you're giving them. So they threw us a lifeline, and we survived without sinking at that time. But now even India, the financial assurances, what they're talking about is not the whole thing. Certainly the money that they gave us recently, that is not part of the restructure. That money has to be repaid, and those are not very long-term loans. These are commercial credits. You see bilateral, currency swaps, etc. So when you look at the volume of what is to be restructured, it is perhaps a much smaller amount of what is owed to India than what people think it is, right? So they're also not saying, look, you owe us so much, we are ready to cut off so much. No, that's not the case. And Talal is right. There is competition, obviously, between India and China, about what each other does in Sri Lanka. You see, there was a big issue when a Chinese a vessel, which they said was a research vessel, but the Indians call it a spy vessel, a ship that came and docked in Hambantota. So, and last time around, what happened was they had the photographs of Chinese submarine, Song class submarine, that ticked the Indians off so much, and the whole relationship with the then government kind of changed. And like Talal also alluded to about the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, that has nothing to do with the financing, and they have not, and I repeat, they have not brought that up at all in these discussions. But the relationship that we have with India rests pretty much on some of these bilateral undertakings that have even been included in our own constitution, right? So the 13th Amendment is the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, right? And we have undertaken to implement these things. And the current issue is that the Indian side wishes to see the full implementation of the 13th Amendment. And as of last week, you saw many people, including Buddhist monks, sort of nationalist forces, others saying absolutely no way. And they burnt copies of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which really means, giving police and land powers to the northern province. And some go to the extent of saying it also means the merger of the northern and eastern provinces, which is a third of the country. But there is the court determination that that demerger is legit. So there are various ways in which this is read. But once again, we, in my view, has to open a much stronger links with India. For instance, what's happening in South India, now that Kankasanture, the KKS airport, which is at the top of the island, northernmost part, once again, I don't know for how long, is open for international air traffic. And if I was running this country, I would immediately set up a large warehouse type IT facility in KKS and I mean Palali, sorry, and same area, and make people work in Jaffna as sort of part of a large operation in South India, right? And we can have 3 flights a day or 4 flights a day. Just integrate economic activity in South India and here. And one last point is the power grid. You see, I mean, we have so much potential in the Mana wind tunnel, which they say is only second to North Sea offshore. We can certainly produce a lot of wind power that certainly cannot be consumed within the country. But if we connect to the grid, which have been in discussion for the last 20 plus years, right? We can start exporting this power. And these are doable things. But one of the alternate parties that are campaigning right now says we will never let foreign ownership in the power sector, right? But the flip side of that is, who's going to bring the large amount of dollars to buy these wind turbines and all these things? Is a highly capital intensive at the beginning. And if you are only selling in Sri Lanka in rupees, how are you going to pay these things back, right? So these are contradictory arguments. But given the sort of the quote unquote anti-India bias that this particular alternate group of people who are now sort of, unfortunately, from my point of view, gaining some traction, have always been anti-India, right? So the emerging picture is in one word, scary.
So thank you for that. And actually, I want to bring in Sharmini here as well, concerning precisely the sort of restructuring discussions that we see right now, turning to the prognosis and also the trajectory going forward. On one hand, it strikes me that the debt restructuring of Sri Lanka by the IMF is incredibly logical, and many of the solutions and conditions stipulated are there to guide and to nudge the country towards not just more fiscal discipline, but also careful rethinking concerning how to boost public revenue and also reform the way economic structures and industrial policies work at large, although perhaps more the former than the latter, so to speak. And yet, on the other hand, as Harsha hinted at just then, there's a concern, right, which is to do with the masses, the people, the population on the ground currently in Sri Lanka, who seem to be and perhaps rightfully so, skeptical, wary of any and all sorts of further demands and expectations to be imposed upon them, not just in virtue of accepting cuts to subsidies, which we touched upon in the early stages of today's discussion, but also drastic shifts in industrial policies and, of course, the public sector, which has now emerged to be a sprawling and arguably very oversized gargantuan entity, both in terms of public service, civil service, and also state-related and affiliated enterprises. Are you concerned about the possible backlash and obstinacy, Sharmini, or do you see these as transitory barriers and hurdles that can be overcome as we move forward, provided that a debt restructuring plan goes through?
Okay, before I take that on, I just want to go back to a couple of the things that came up on the debt side. First of all, China's argument that why should we have to listen to the IMF? You don't have to listen to the IMF. This is the international economic architecture of which all 190 odd countries participate. Okay, and they agree that the IMF is the institution that somebody has to do it. We can't have 5 different debt sustainability analysis. Somebody has to do it, and there's an enormous technical methodology underlying this. Okay, there are like a massive set of papers that were published in 2015, so you can access all that on the IMF website. I don't want to defend the IMF. I'm defending the international economic order that China benefited from. China sits at the board at the IMF. It is I think it has now the second or third largest voting power. So it agreed to those rules. It agreed to the debt sustainability analysis. It agreed to everything. And then when it comes to actually having it implemented, they do not implement it. And I'm saying we can't have an international economic order which is designed to save the debtors as efficiently as possible. The system is set up to save sovereign countries like us quickly. So, to say, well, why should we listen? We'll have a new set of rules. Well, you can have that discussion, but don't do it by delaying us, right? Because there is a system for this. So that would be one point. The other thing on India, let me clarify. There's no special treatment of India. In the cutoff date that the government announced on April 12th, that is the cutoff date. So anything given after that, and they threw us a lifeline, but it came after that. So that those anything coming after that, we said we would not restructure. Okay. And the other part we agreed not to restructure were swaps, central bank central bank swaps, which are very commonly left out of debt restructuring, because central bank to central bank swaps are very short term, and so they're not subject to long-term restructuring. So yes, the amount that India has is small it's not the entire 4 billion, but that's because they gave it to us in that post period. And it's kind of like saying you throw somebody a lifeline and then you say, oh, excuse me, I'm going to restructure that too. Exposed. So it was very clear at the time that they would be not subject to restructuring, but we were grateful to have it. Okay, nobody was giving us any money. Not China, not Japan, not the Western countries. Nobody was giving us any financing in May and June. In July. So let's not, forget it. They're not getting special. I just want to clarify that they're not getting special treatment in that sense. And had China or the United States or somebody else given us, they would have got the same treatment. So, that's the situation there. Now, on what you're saying, I'm very concerned, that these sort of, in some sense, reactionary forces would come back and sort of want to reestablish. This is why I said it's hard to break the hold that those who benefited from the system have in trying to get through these reforms. We all agree we need to go from here to there. I think we need to do a better job of explaining to people why these reforms are necessary. And it's a question of who will bear the burden, right? It's not as if, if we got a ton of debt relief, which, by the way, people are not willing to give us, the rest of the world is not willing to give us, it's a fine balance. If you got a lot of debt write down, we wouldn't have to do such painful reforms. But the sad truth is, we don't have anybody who is generous enough to write that much down. In fact, they're going to all scream when they see the amount of debt write down that's implicit in the IMF's DSA. There is debt sustainability analysis. There is a significant amount of write down. Okay, so write down meaning debt reduction. It doesn't have to be an upfront haircut, like I said. So they have taken that to what is plausible. Okay, but it still leaves us with a very high debt burden to service. Don't think that debt is going to zero. It's going to be still, if you look at the letter in India, it gives the benchmarks, and it still places us at high risk of debt distress, even after the restructuring. So we have to do what we have to do. Now, the question is, who bears the burden? As a country, we're not going to get the debt relief even. I hope we can get what the IMF has put down. It's pretty generous, and we need it. But if we don't do it, so what are the choices? If you don't raise taxes, you have only two other choices. You can cut spending, but then that means you have to privatize and get rid of, maybe you have to lay off public sector workers, right? So this is not painless either. Or you can have, the government can borrow, and then the interest rates will go above 30%. 30%, you can go to 40, 50%. Or you can print more money, right? And then inflation will be back to 60, 70, 80. This is what happens in Argentina. They opt for the inflation. They opt not to pay taxes, and they have high inflation. And we all know that inflation hurts the poorest people the most. Richer people are not as affected by inflation as poor people. So when all these people say they don't want to pay taxes, and I'm saying, well, who is going to pay? Who's going to bear the burden and of the past excesses? So that, people have to realize, and I think we don't do enough communication to explain to people, look, it's a choice of, who is best off in the country to take the hit, because somebody has to take it. And I think the poorest of this country have suffered enough. Harsha would just, gave an example. So when we have high inflation, those people suffer. So we have gone for massive subsidies and also these price controls. Price controls affect rich people and poor people. And because rich people consume more, they benefit more from price controls. If you control the price of eggs, and I, as a rich person, consume 10 eggs a week, you can bet I'm benefiting from that, right? Much more than a poor person who might consume an egg these days once a month. So you have to realize that this whole complaint is about who bears the burden. It's not going to lessen the burden. That's all I want to say, is that inflation will come back. High interest rates will come back if you don't. Sri Lanka's tax ratio is so low. It's 8.5% of GDP. It needs to be more like 18. I mean, we're trying to get to 12 and everybody's screaming. So yes, I am concerned, but I would hope and want our politicians to communicate honestly with people, explain to them what the issue is, explain it's a question of who's going to bear the burden, and it is the top 40% of the income distribution that has to bear the burden, not the bottom 40, which is what inflation and other suboptimal ways of adjusting would do. And make no mistake, whether we like it or not, the adjustment will happen. It's a question of who bears the burden. So the adjustment is happening even now. That's why we are feeling it. But we have no external financing. And so we have to finance ourselves at the moment. So that's why we need this debt restructuring quickly, so we can at least access some external money, because new money will flow in once you have a debt restructuring, and we have to grow ourselves out of this problem. And we were just discussing, there are plenty of ways to grow ourselves out of this problem. And you have to give people hope. And I think people would have hope if we explain to them that we can grow. We don't have to be in this situation. We can grow, but we just have to adjust very quickly and get the debt restructuring, and we can grow. So I think there's a hopeful message here. It's not like doom and gloom forever. We can grow and we can get out of this. But we need a bit of honesty and a bit of resolve to bear with this for a few more months till we get the restructuring done.
Thank you so much. And it strikes me that not only is there a question of political burdens or the political question of burden allocation amongst the people, there's also a further question concerning parliamentarian and partisan politics, which is who's going to bear the brunt and the mantle of pushing forward these reforms and convincing folks that, the hard labor is worth it at the end of the day. So I'm going to return to Harsha very shortly in that very interesting exchange with Sharmini. But I want to bring in Shanta here, which is with two parts to this question, really. The first is, what is your prognosis from your end concerning Sri Lanka's sort of economic trajectory over the next 3 to 5 years? And secondly, if you were to, or maybe, of course you are and you have already, to advise Mr. Wickremesinghe on his approach to, Sri Lanka's developmental policies going forward and then long-term growth plans, what would be the main takeaways and upshots that you would offer as advice, so to speak, if you could? Thank you.
Okay, I thanks for those questions, because I wanted to pick up on the Sharmini ended on a positive note, and I want to make it even more positive at this point. First, to say that we've mentioned political will and the fear of politicians like Harsha to advocate for some of these genuinely growth-promoting pro-poor policies, because they're perceived as anti-poor or as perceived as against the people. And I think we have an opportunity here, an unprecedented opportunity, to take these difficult but pro-poor reforms, such as privatizing public enterprises, such as relaxing the Paddy Lands Act, such as liberalizing trade. These are actually going to benefit the poor. And let me add, converting fuel subsidies into cash transfers, targeted cash transfers. These are all, whenever you propose these things, and I've been involved in them, as Harsha mentioned, for years, there's a backlash from, supposedly from the poor, but it's actually the middle class and the upper classes on the pretense of defending the poor. This is a time to call their bluff. And I think the reason we can do that is because of the Argalaya movement. The Argalaya movement was the one that called the government's bluff. I still remember that poster that said, people should not be afraid of the government. The government should be afraid of the people. That to me is the leitmotif. That is about the accountability. And all of these policies that I just described are the ones that actually will strengthen accountability, that actually empower the poor vis-a-vis the government. All the traditional policies, this welfare policy that we've been subjected to for 75 years, are actually disempowering of the poor. They actually make reduce the poor. I mean, just let me give you one example, which is the energy subsidy. If when you give somebody an energy subsidy, you're telling the poor people, if you want to get a benefit from the government, you have to consume fuel. Now compare that to giving them a cash transfer. When you give them a cash transfer, you're saying you can spend it on whatever you like. You can use it to educate your children. You can do some improvements on your house. You can spend on your business. That is empowering to poor people, the way that energy subsidies are disempowering. And that's the way we have to make this argument. But also, I think there is some support for that, as brought out by the Argalaya movement. And if you want to know, I mean, so my advice to President Wickremesinghe, which I have given, Sharmini has been there too, is basically this: be bold. This is not the time to worry about incremental changes. This is a time, and as Harsha mentioned, I mean, President Wickremesinghe doesn't have a large political constituency of his own in Parliament, but many people like that in other countries are the ones who actually spearheaded the transformative reforms. So this is the chance for Sri Lanka to turn the tide in a big way. And again, as we said, let's make sure we don't come back to the debt crisis in 5 years.
Thank you so much. Now we're coming up to, and I'm acutely aware that we're coming up to near the end of our scintillating discussion today. But before we move on to concluding remarks, I'd like to bring in Harsha here on two fronts, really. The first is the question on Shanta's point just then. Do you think the current incumbent president is up for it? Is he in a position to indeed make these structural changes, or do you think there needs to be an overhaul to the government and power in order for these changes to come about? And the second question, going back to the ongoing dialectic and interaction between you and Sharmini, is I was just wondering if you wanted to say anything about the replies from Sharmini on both the China front, but also India's relationship at large with the debt restructuring and the economic trajectory of Sri Lanka. So I want to bring you in on these two fronts, Harsha.
Thanks, Brian. On the China-India thing, I mean, I know it's rhetoric. I mean, we all know, but this is the position that is being taken. As second or third most powerful member, like you said in the IMF. You see, you have to walk the talk. So while that is true on paper, what we are experiencing here is the reality. So I don't know how, but it needs to happen, and me as an opposition MP, we have said that we are willing to support the government in all and any of their efforts to resolve the problem with China. And that is what saddens me. The story doing the rounds that they don't want me particularly back in running the Committee on Public Finance. I mean, I really don't, I'm not going begging for anything, but it would be an opportunity lost. Because even though I refuse to be a member of his cabinet because of the Rajapaksas and the association he has with them, protecting these people, because these are the people who really cause a lot of tragedy, for all our citizens. Saying, look, first we need to fix the economy and then we can catch the crooks. I completely disagree. Transparency and accountability of government, that is number one. And like Shanta said, Aragale was about that. And to say that is in the back burner is not going to fly. You see, you have to do both of these things. So we are bringing right and center, up front in our plan that we are going to propose on Tuesday. That would be number one priority. It cannot be ignored. And that is why I didn't join him. But we were doing a reasonably good job in the Committee on Public Finance. We asked questions, we asked for analysis, we sent them the finance ministry back several times, come back with better and more credible analysis, tell us why. So that's how I see that. But in the context of like I said, we are willing to support anything that we can do to resolve the China issue, and I'll leave it at that. And I do appreciate the point made by Sharmini. Yeah, I mean, we can't ask them, India, to restructure the trade credits that they gave us and all that. That's not part of the architecture anyway, and we have to find the money to pay those debts back. But just today's newspapers say, or yesterday's local papers say, that we still have to make $3.2 billion debt payments to the multilaterals this year, even after the suspension. The discussion we didn't have is based on the DSA and the leaked letter by the Indians to the IMF about the gross financing need. How we're going to bring it down from 31% of GDP to 13% of GDP by 2027 or something like that. So what about the discussion on domestic debt? You look at the interest payment for this year. Out of 2.2 trillion rupees of interest, only 0.2 trillion is going towards servicing foreign debt. 2 trillion is local debt. I mean, this is, in my view, the elephant in the room, and nobody is really willing to discuss this. And how the earlier question about how much taxes can be raised is limited at the margin. Yeah, let's say we squeeze everybody to the bone, Sharmini. How much can we get? How much can we get? Another 50 billion, right? Another 25 billion, right? So what I'm saying is the big issues need to be addressed. And people say, don't even talk about it. If you talk about it, there's going to be a bank run. I don't agree. I mean, there are ways in which, you can manage these things. There are countries who've done these things and succeeded. You're not talking about a haircut. You can figure a way out. I mean, EPF is a cash flow matter that we need to resolve, inflows and outflows, and all of that. So that's that. And whether the president is up to it. He's the one who brought me into politics. I mean, he's the one who gave me all the books to read. He's the one, I was his understudy, so I know his thinking. I know his thinking. And so what he's trying to do is very similar or what he is doing is very similar to the blueprint that I prepared and tabled in Parliament. I'm just updating it right now, version 2.0. And that is about, how do we grow out of this, right? Sharmini's point is absolutely valid. We have to grow out of this problem. And where is growth going to come from? Certainly, it's not going to come from domestic, consumption. It has to come from consumption of domestically produced goods internationally. And in order to do that, we need to do the kinds of trade and investment policy reforms. We have to do those, right? Because unless we do that, and I can't go back to what I said at the very beginning, companies are closing down, interest rates are too high, jobs are getting lost. So we are just going to stagnate at this rate and perhaps even, shrink further. And I don't know what would happen then. But we have to create jobs, right? So how do you create jobs in a shrinking economy, right? Where is demand going to come from? Certainly not local. It has to be outside. So that I am hopeful. Brian, I'm doing this because I love this country and I want to contribute. I want to make sure that I play a role in taking this country out of this mess, right? It is very difficult for people like myself in politics because people don't necessarily understand the complexity of the problem, and simplistic answers, I will do this, I will do that, there is no pain in my solution, it's nonsense, right? So yes, RW, his thinking is right, but he's forgotten the other side of the coin. He's forgotten that people are, they need to eat to survive. They actually need food. Mr. President, you must understand that. This is beyond the equation. People will die without food. That's the reality. Kids are dropping out of school. That cannot happen, right? So that is why people like myself, my party, we believe in what we call a social market economy, two sides of the coin. And I'm going to stop here. Is one of economic liberalism about markets, about competition, right? And political liberalism about equity, social justice. So these are the two sides of this one coin. So that's how I think that we will, and it will happen because there has to be a mandate. The mandate must be gotten. How we will take this forward.
Thank you so much, Harsha. And I'm acutely aware that we've come to the end of this discussion. But before we conclude, I'd just like to bring in Talal to see if you have any sort of concluding remarks to the audience at large. Talal, over to you for the last word. You're muted.
Sorry, Brian. There was a technical, I couldn't hear your question.
Not an issue. Just wanted to see if you would like to have the last word on today's panel.
Right. So my concluding remarks would be what I mentioned before. I mean, I agree with a lot with what Harsha said. We need to liberalize. One thing is we cannot move forward like having a regime where there is import substitution. So one thing is, of course, liberalize trade, have free trade agreements. The resistance here is that people see free trade agreements as like other countries trying to take advantage of us. But why don't we see it as us taking advantage of other countries? I mean, look, India is set to be a $10 trillion economy by 2035. And we are the only country who close to the region who has a FTA with India and with Pakistan. Or we are going to conclude hopefully soon with China. So a place for Indian companies to access China or vice versa. So here again, the thing that, only Sri Lanka, there's also this other thing that I want to state is that we think that Sri Lankan companies have to do everything to export. It doesn't have to be. I mean, look at Thailand. I mean, Thailand has a very robust export industry when it comes to manufacturing cars, but you don't really see a Thai brand. It's mostly Japanese brands. So we should open up to the world. But in my concluding remarks, I would say that we are at a crossroad. So either we can be like how India did, like how Dr. Manmohan Singh did as finance minister, do the reforms and never ever even have to think about going back to the IMF, or we can be like Argentina and, constantly, every 3 to 5 years go back and, get the same prescriptions. So it's really a choice for the people. But at the moment, I think in the short term, we might need a sort of a new mandate for a party to come in. A general elections could be a way to, if a certain party can get a strong mandate to follow all these reforms, that would be the best way possible.
Thank you all so much. We are incredibly honored and privileged to have heard from the four of you. Absolutely fantastic speakers with so much insight and so much generosity and magnanimity with your contributions to the discussion. The situation in Sri Lanka is obviously difficult, and I'd like to take this opportunity to wish the people in Sri Lanka, all the very best. And thank you all for tuning in and joining in the discussion back at home. And stay tuned for the next Oxford Political Review panel event and discussion that's just around the corner. Thank you all very much, and goodbye.
Okay, thank you.